God was with him. From slave to liberator, Moses had the heart of a leader.
Could not be more excited to jump into Exodus this morning. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2. And talking about this idea of leadership. Could you do me a favor? Could you take my mic down a little bit? I think it's kind of throwing everything back. Thank you. So this morning, we're going to jump into a brand new series, and we're going to be here for a while. And hopefully, it will be one that is going to be encouraging you, and one that is hopefully motivating you a little bit when it comes to leadership, because leadership is not just for those in authority or those who are ruling and reigning, but leadership, I believe, as we're going to see through this series in the life of Moses, is truly a learned thing. And leadership is not something that's set apart for those who are just born leaders, right? It is something that we are able to learn and grow and develop, and all of us, I truly believe, have room to grow in our own leadership, whether that's with your business and the things that you're doing with work, whether that's in your home life, whether that's leading even yourself. I have truly been blessed to be part of an organization over the last couple months that I've been meeting with them on a regular basis and learning so much about my own personal leadership. A lot of things that I like to hear, and then there's been quite a bit more things I'm learning in my leadership that I don't want to hear. And I really don't like hearing, but they're like, you know what, if you really want to grow, you got to start working on X, Y, and Z. And this morning, as we're going to start this idea of leadership and learn leadership, I want us to kind of think through that as the lens. Like, what is Moses teaching us through his leadership and how he interacts with God on a regular basis? One of the major reasons for this series is that as I was praying for 2021, I'm praying that it's the year that we can all kind of take the field, if that makes sense. This year that we all become starters here at Community Bible Church, and this year that we all know our shape, how God's wired us and built us for kingdom use, and that we would start to put that into practice here. I pray also that you would also learn how to put it into practice in your home life, leading your spouse, leading yourself in that way. But regardless, I pray that that's where we're going to be heading over the next weeks together as we study the life of Moses. And here's one question I want you to ask this morning. Ready? The question is simple, and it's going to kind of drive the series, and it's this: why not me? Why not me, right? And I'm assuming that when you answer that question, why not me for leadership, you probably have 6 or 7 reasons why not you, right? I'm not really good at it. It's not my job. I don't work that way at work. I'm too young. I'm too inexperienced. Whatever your reason is for not leading, Moses is going to show us that he had a better reason for not leading, and yet he followed Christ's or God's example and leads. And so this series, I want you to thinking, why not me? Because here's the reality: God is truly ahead of you, paving the way for you, and he is setting up your future for you. And as he has gone ahead of you, he's asking you to learn along the way so we all become better leaders. So that's what we're going to be heading into as we look into the life of Moses. And Moses shows us that you can trust in a sovereign God. You can be his friend, which is amazing, that he can be your coach, and that God can truly be your mentor. We're going to look at that. So we're going to get some context this morning. We're going to look at some verses to kind of set us up. So there won't be a ton of key points probably per se today, a lot of context as we kind of start into this series on the life of Moses. But let's jump into Exodus chapter 1, beginning in verses 1 through 6. And this will give us the context of what we're going to be talking about as we begin the life of Moses. Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the son of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. So the context is this: we've just left Genesis, which Spoiler alert, we're going to be heading into Genesis in summer, and it's going to take us forever, so get used to that. So we're going to jump into Genesis later, but for today, I want you to understand we're coming out of Genesis. We've just left the patriarchs, and there's about 70 people that have been following Joseph into Egypt. And if you don't know, Joseph was now almost second or third in command of Egypt. He was given a ton of favor by God in the midst of what he was doing, and now he has been leading. And over the generations, people have died away, and Joseph is no longer there as well. Joseph has died, and all his brothers and all that generation. So you would think if all that generation's passed, if all that generation is gone, if all that generation's died off, you'd think, okay, so that was a pretty short story, right? Genesis begins, there's Joseph, there's 70 people, they're all dead. Great, now what? But you got to read verse 7 to tell us then what. So then what was a whole lot of baby making. So that's what's going on. Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. So let's just call that what it is. They had a whole lot of babies. There wasn't a whole lot going on, but they were making babies. And they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Not only were they just making babies, there was a lot of babies being made. They went from 70 people to what many historians say there was now 2.3 million Israelites. That's a lot of babies. You're going to see that in just a second. Like, these ladies are like, that's kind of their deal, right? And all the ladies in the room are like, please don't make that my deal. But that was the deal, right? They had grown exponentially. 2.3 million Israelites now are in Egypt. And Egypt is starting to freak out about that many people. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 to 10. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if they already have, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So that's really key because it's telling us that this new king who has arose is an interesting word. It's arose, which basically is telling me this guy may not have been part of the family line. This guy may have taken it by force. There could have been some other stories with it. And many historians debate which pharaoh this actually is. So let me give you three options. And for many of you guys who don't get history and context, you're kind of like, just give me the main points, stick with me. For those who are in the history and context and like, how does this make sense in the real world? Here's your context. So here's the history of what was going on. There's three different pharaohs that could have been a part of this. There was Thutmose III, Thutmose. I probably butchered it. He was ruling from 1483 to 1450, which would put the Exodus around 1445. And this is the earliest that many historians would say the Exodus happened. And then you have Seti I, and this was the guy that many in the Jewish library, if you studied a Jewish library and rabbis would say, this was the ruling pharaoh, and he ruled from 1303 to 1290, which would put him around the 18th and 19th century. So the first guy would be 15th century, this guy would be 18th, 19th century, and then this would put the Exodus around 1260. The third person or pharaoh that you probably have heard more about, and you probably heard this name a lot, and that's this dude called Ramses, right? So Ramses II was put into power in 1279 and ruled till 1213, which would put the Exodus somewhere around 1290. And many kind of say, well, it's the later date, it's the earlier date. I tend to lean toward the earliest date. I think it makes sense biblically as you kind of look at the dates that Scripture gives us in the Old and New Testament. Even the book of Acts has something to say about the date of the Exodus, which is interesting. But of the three, I'm going to say the first was ruling and reigning. But regardless of whoever it was, they did not know Joseph. They didn't know the history. They didn't trust the Israelites. And this Pharaoh was out to take out the Israelites because they were coming way too powerful. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. If war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So that statement, let us deal shrewdly, lest they multiply and break out, right? This whole thing. This rationale is really a lie wrapped up in something that sounds really reasonable, right? So somebody once said, there are certain lies that are wrapped up in a skin of reason, or to put it another way, thin skins of reason wrapped around a lie. So the lie was the center of this argument, but they wrapped it in reason. The reason was, hey, these guys could become more powerful and take us out. That seems rational. That seems reasonable. The lie was truly what was behind it, and that is that, hey, these guys are they're going to come against my power and my authority, and I got to take them out. The real thing that Pharaoh was worried about was losing power, losing control, fear of being irrelevant, and truly nothing has changed in 2020, 2021, isn't it? How many leaders do you know, how many leaders have you seen that wrap a lie in a whole lot of reason and logic? You probably don't know anybody, I'm sure. But just imagine there was some people governing, per se, or ruling somewhere out there that loved to wrap lies in reason. And this was Pharaoh. And the fear was simply that: power, control, becoming irrelevant. But here's the thing: fear, unhealthy fear, is the focus on ourselves. Unhealthy fear, always runs inward. Fear closes the door and bunkers down. Unhealthy fear always ends with you at the center. I was going to put a visual together this morning, but imagine if I had this long piece of yarn strewn through everything, and I was going to do it, but then I'm like, yeah, I'll probably knock something over. But imagine there was this long yarn kind of woven through everything, and all you saw on stage was this big piece of yarn woven everywhere. And this yarn would represent this idea of fear. And as you tracked this piece of yarn, you could kind of follow it around the stage and pick it up, and wherever you went, you could kind of just continue to try to see, where does it end, where does it end, where does it end, where does it end, where does it end? Fear, unhealthy fear, if you tracked it from beginning to end, would not only start with yourself, it would also end with yourself. And unhealthy fear says it's about me, it's about losing control, it's always about me. But healthy fear would be to follow that piece of yarn, you'd be picking up, follow, and at the end of it, you would find God at the end of it and say, wow, okay, that's worth fear. Because he is the one truly in control. But many of us stay stuck in our own fears: fear of failure, fear of not being heard, fear of being wrong, fear of being taken advantage of, fear of being known, fear of the future. And you see, Pharaoh had those same fears. He had these fears of power and losing control of what was to happen. Pharaoh, I believe, and Satan are very closely linked in our own lives, but specifically in the narrator's mind. Narrator knew, he wanted you to understand, hey, this guy Pharaoh, I want you to understand how he operates like the enemy of Satan, because there's a big common place between the two, linking this idea of fear to not only Pharaoh, but to our greatest enemy, and that is that who is constantly causing fear in your life and world. He says, we will deal shrewdly with them, lest they escape the land. Verse 11, therefore, because of fear, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread. It went from fear to dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Do you understand the imagery that Moses, the writer of Exodus, is trying to get us to understand? When you have fear in your life, you will be tied to it. And that fear, if you consistently stay tied to your fear, will ultimately link you into slavery and bondage. And he says, I don't want that for you. And the people of Israel, they felt the weight of this Pharaoh putting this work on them. But here's the amazing thing I love in this, right? The more he put work on them, the more they multiplied. Can you imagine the frustration level of Pharaoh, who he's like, the more I hurt these people, the more they grow. They just keep having kids. It's got to stop. This is ridiculous. I don't know why they're so happy and making kids all the time, but I'm trying to put slavery and oppression on them. And they continued to trust God in the midst of all this was. The harder I pushed them, the more they multiplied. Speaking of God who is over protecting the Israelites. This idea of putting more on them was important because it was this idea of the kingdom of Pharaoh, the kingdom of Egypt would be more important than any other kingdom that they served. And for a while, Israel got it right. They followed God and they trusted God even in the midst of all the suffering that they were going through. But for us, in 2020, my fear, to put it that way, is that we would miss the kingdom of God here and now and what God's doing here and now, and putting all of our weight and all of our worry and all of our frustration into leadership that we have no control over per se, but we trust that God does and is ruling and reigning even today. Now, let's go into the rest of the story, because in the rest of the story, you get an anomaly. And the anomaly is this. It is the fact that the hero of chapter 1 and 2, before we even get into Moses, is women. And many of you are kind of like, okay, cool, that makes sense. That's the way it should be. Amen, right? However, in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, to put women as heroes this early on in literature was unheard of. There is no way women, in their mind, livestock, pets, that's kind of the initial analogy, could have any worth or value. And Moses comes in, God comes in and says, hey, check out the heroes in chapter 1 and 2 of Exodus story. It's women. This is awesome. Verse 17. Let's go into here. But the king of Egypt said, verse 15, let's go back a second. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sipporah and the other Puah, that's a fun name, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. Midwives. So not just like women, now he's gone women into a lower category of midwife. These midwives were there to deliver the Egyptian babies and to make sure they were nursed and cared for until the Pharaoh and until all the Egyptian ladies were able to take care of them on their own. They would just take care of them up until a certain age, and then they would turn them over. And the Egyptian ladies were like, "This is awesome! I don't have to take care of the whiny baby at 0 month, 1 month, 2 month, 3 month old." Right? We often joke around in our house, like if we could have kids and they'd come out at 1, we'd have more. But the fact that they have to go through the 0 to 1 stage, that's a whole other story. Nobody really primes you for that. But as they were doing this story, the midwives came at the height of this story. These midwives were the important piece to this story. Because he says, these ladies are having way too many babies. So here's what I want you to do. As soon as they have a baby, and you identify it as a boy or a girl, if it's a boy, kill it, and that way we'll be done with this whole thing, right? So all the ladies in the room are like, phew. All the guys in the room are like, wait, what? Because that was the way he was going to get rid of these Israelites from multiplying and continuing to take over the land. But here is the beauty, and here's where the midwives become the hero in the story. Verse 17, but the midwives, don't miss this, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the male children live. Did you catch the beginning? But the midwives feared God. But the midwives didn't fear Pharaoh. They probably did, but not as much as they feared the God in whom they serve. To which all the guys in the room are like, amen. All the ladies in the room are like, amen. Because these ladies feared God more than Pharaoh. The ladies knew what Exodus chapter 34, 6 and 7 would say. The Lord is compassionate and a gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity upon the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. They knew the God they served, and if they followed through with this, there would be some consequences. So they feared God more than they feared man. Which brings us to principle number 1 today, and that is this: leaders worth following fear God more than they fear men. And I know that's a basic, but as we begin the story, keep in mind that they are using women in the sense to say, watch the model. Watch the humble, lowly model of the humble and lowly becoming the greatest in this story. So then we see what happens next in verse 18. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the children live?" They didn't follow through. The midwives said to Pharaoh, this is so good, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," which would have been offensive as it was, but then they get even more offensive. Because the Hebrew women, they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. It's like we can't even get to them fast enough. They're just like popping babies out like this. It's crazy. And every time we try and get there, there's just a new baby, right? And it was not only a slam on like the Pharaoh's wives of like, why can't our ladies do that? But it's also like this weird anomaly where it's like the Hebrew wives, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of a weird compliment where it's like, you know what you do really well? You birth babies like crazy, and that's awesome, right? I mean, but they came up with this excuse, like we just can't get there fast enough. They're like out of the womb, and then all of a sudden they're like walking around and drinking coffee. It's crazy. We can't get there fast enough. It's crazy how fast these ladies are having babies. So God, verse 20, I love this. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. Do you get this repetition? Every time there's opposition, every time there's fear, every time there's punishment, every time there's an act by Pharaoh to try and stop the hand of God, what does God do? He multiplies, he grows, he makes them very strong. Every single time. Watching God's hand in history, every single time, Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, are put under the thumb of whatever ruling Rome government there is, they can flourish. I think we in the States have for so long had it so easy. And I think we are scared of what oppression could mean. We're scared of what a different leader could mean. Let's just put that out there. We're worried about what's going to happen. But in reality, the truth of the matter is, our king is not here ruling as a human being here because he's already done that, and he's in heaven ruling on our behalf, controlling not only our government, but every government around the world, and God will do what he will do. We trust him. They trusted him, and as they trusted him, I love these words, that they grew and multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. These ladies who could have no families, these families meant status, stability, strength, worth, value. That's what they meant to these ladies. God says, because you followed me, I will give you strength and worth and value. And he gave them families. But Pharaoh continued to follow fear and hate and anger and went even stronger. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. I'm done. I'm done playing games with these people. It's over. We're taking them out. And can you imagine living during this time frame when every single boy was cast into the Nile? Amazing, crazy. You're going to see throughout the book of Exodus, the river Nile is very, very symbolic. There is life and death in the river Nile. You'll see that throughout the Exodus. But in this scenario, the men are cast away and says, we are done playing games. I'm taking them all out. Verse 22. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now, the story takes a drastic change. If you were watching the movie, you would go from a scene where it's chaos, grief, frustration, terror, as kids are cast into this river, to the very next scene cuts to an older man and an older woman from a priestly family, and they have their 3rd child. And it's important to note that Jochebed, that's the father's name, and Aram, that's the wife's name, you'll get that in Exodus chapter 6, from the house of Levi were priestesses. They were followers of God and leaders of, today would be pastor and pastor's wife. This would be the whole thing of leading, following God. And the woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw that he was a fine child. I'm like, what does that mean? Fine child. Highlight, circle that. Fine child is a unique word. This is just an Easter egg, so if you're checking out with me, just stick with me for 1 second. This is just for me. This is a fun word, because this word fine child is actually the same Hebrew word that God used in Genesis chapter 1 when he said, and it was good. God created the heavens. God created the earth. God created man. He said it was good. That was this word. So it's almost a rebirth, a new creation God is doing in the life of Moses, that he is good. He was a fine child, and she hid him for 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. So she takes her baby, 3 months old, puts it in this basket, seals it all up. That pitch, bitumen, that's this idea that was the thing to make it waterproof and buoyant, and they would actually float and not take on water, which is pretty amazing in and of itself. And she sent it down the river. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And so if you don't know Moses, let me just kind of give you the family. You have Jochebed as the dad, you have Aram as the mom, you have the oldest sister of Miriam, and then you have the second son who is Aaron, and then you have Moses. So 3 kids. The oldest sister is the one staying at the distance and watching this go down the river. And here's the story you probably know well, verse 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying, and she took pity on him. This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse for the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called, of all people, of any midwife, of all Israelites, she calls Moses' mom. The faithfulness of your God is found in details in the book of Exodus. The faithfulness of your God says he could have chosen anybody to wean Moses. When all the other babies were gone, he's going to use this leader in powerful ways. And he's gracious and good enough to Moses' mother to allow her to be the one to raise him, to nurse him. So she went and found the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take the child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. Not only will you take care of your son, I'm going to pay you. Any moms in the room be like, where's my pay, right? Like, that would be awesome. Like, not just to raise my kids, but get paid to raise my kids. That's a whole other deal, right? That's awesome. And so she is paid to take care of him, and she's given wages, and God is faithful in the midst of it. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And we see that Moses' mother has such a view of God's sovereignty. She trusts him as she lays the baby in the water and as he moves forward. And here's the beautiful thing. She knows and trusts God's sovereignty in the midst of this scenario. Leaders worth following have a healthy view of God's sovereignty. Leaders worth following have a fear of God more than a fear of men, and leaders worth following have a healthy view of God's sovereignty, that God is moving ahead of you and preparing the way for you. And this view of God's sovereignty is going to come into play here in our last verse this morning. We're almost there. Our last verse this morning is in verse chapter 10. Because in view of God's sovereignty, he has multiplied Israel. In view of God's sovereignty, he's preparing something to happen in Israel because the numbers are getting so big. What's going to happen? We don't know. But here's the reality. Also in God's sovereignty, Moses' mother needed to have it because of verse 10. And here is where the scene would stop and the movie would pick up in another episode to come next week. And you'd be like, what's going to happen? Because it ends with this scene in verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Mothers in the room, can you imagine you've weaned your child 3 months, 4 months old, and then you have this unbearable task of turning your child over and saying, they're no longer my son. They're no longer my daughter. I trust God in his sovereignty that no matter what happens, I'm turning him over to Pharaoh and his daughter, and she will take it from here. And she's not sure what's going to happen. She has no idea where this is going to go. But she trusts God enough to let Moses take on a new mother. When the child grew older, she put him before Pharaoh's daughter, and he was drawn out of the water. And she called him Moses because he was drawn out of the water. This morning, as we begin the life of Moses, we begin with that context. We begin with the fact that God will use unlikely people, God will use whoever means necessary, and God will highlight the humble and the meek. And God, in this story, uses these strong women. Did you notice there wasn't one guy hero in this entire story? There was midwives, there was the mother, there was Pharaoh's daughter, and there was Miriam. All women. The only guy in this is Pharaoh. So read into that what you will. But the hero was put on display on purpose, and God is going to do something amazing through this man. I don't know what you're going through right now, or what your week or 2021 even has been like so far. But here's what I know. Leaders have a healthy view of God's sovereignty. And so as we close, I want us to just sing a song. We haven't sung it in a while, but I think it really fits a lot of what we've been through in 2020, and it fits a lot of, I think, our uncertainty heading into 2021. And so I'm going to have Rich come up and the team and lead us as we close out this morning. And I pray that this would be a song that you could hear and listen to the verses of this song, and maybe think of where it is for you personally in the lyrics of this, in the verses. But I also pray that you would really sing loud at the chorus and the bridge, because there's so much right now that is so uncertain. But here's the thing. Leaders worth following have a healthy view of God's sovereignty. They know that God has not left the scene. For me personally, let me just put this out there, I am still learning to grow in my view of God's sovereignty. I felt like it was so clear when we first planted this church, and it was so evident, and God was answering prayers on a regular basis, a daily basis. And I think somewhere along the way, I kind of got way too busy and way too distracted, and I missed the sovereignty of God moving ahead. And what happens is you kind of feel like, I can do it, I can handle it, I'll put in the time, I'll put in the effort, I'll make it happen. And God's reminding all of us, I believe, even through this song, it's not about you. It's trusting in the sovereignty of God and preparing the way before us, that no matter what comes into your life, it was put there by the hand of God, knowing He is faithful to lead you through whatever it currently is. For those of you who are online this morning and aren't able to make it in this morning, I pray that you would hear that as well, that you would understand that God is sovereign even in the midst of whatever you're facing this week. Would you please stand and join us as we close out in song?